Stephen Lloyd.
Thank you very much. With this legal aid, I understand and appreciate that there is some merit in the government's decision to simplify legal aid, and that the costs in recent years have spiralled and become unsustainable, particularly at a time like this. However, very much from what my honourable friend has been saying in her own speech this morning, I do feel that this decision has not really been fully thought through, and the impact to local legal aid services could be devastating. For instance, in my own constituency in Eastbourne, this will mean that only 2 legal firms can continue to provide vital high-quality family law legal aid services. Previously it was 9. These 2 firms will now be taking on the work that the 9 firms formerly undertook, compromising both the effectiveness and speed of delivery with sensitive family issues. We are also going to be losing expertise in one of the most challenging areas of law, and this morning, from my perspective, particularly dealing with the issues of divorce and child custody, which, from a legal aid perspective, particularly from people from disadvantaged backgrounds, I think are going to be one of the areas hardest hit. And in Eastbourne, it's going to be a real challenge. For instance, I recently met a constituent who was unable to find legal representation in Eastbourne because the 2 firms remaining who were able to offer, or would be able to offer, legal aid, one was representing her ex-husband and the other her son. And due to a possible conflict of interest, she had to look elsewhere to either Rye or Brighton, which is a round trip in excess of 50 miles, which really doesn't sound very much. But this particular constituent, I actually know her quite well, is disabled, unable to travel by public transport, so she would have had to travel by taxi. And it really doesn't need me to tell anyone in this room that if you're in receipt of disability living allowance, a taxi fare is a luxury that is not easily affordable. As well as the threat to legal service provision in my own constituency, I'm profoundly concerned that the proposals include the removal of funding for large areas of specialist social welfare-related help and guidance. This is often delivered by local community-based charities within my own constituency, BHT Eastbourne Advice, and the Citizens Advice Bureau, who complement it with more general advice service provided by volunteers. These are crucial, absolutely crucial service providers within every constituency, frankly. And within Eastbourne, these charities risk losing in the region of £230,000 to £250,000 per annum of legal aid funding. Yes, I will.
Wayne David.
I hear the honourable member's sympathetic comments. What would he say specifically to my constituents, for example, in the Bargoed area of the Rumney Valley, where some 375 individuals are claiming legal aid for welfare benefit issues? 450 people stand to lose their access to legal aid on debt issues. What do we say to those people?
Thank you for the intervention. My view is that though the legal aid overall budget has spiralled out of control, I have real concerns about the way that the government is proposing, actually based on what the previous government was proposing, which is one of the ironies of what they're proposing on the legal aid changes. So I do have concerns, which is why I'm here this morning. Yes, certainly.
I do agree with some of the things that he is saying, but in terms of the cost, does he acknowledge that, in fact, the previous government, when it came to the cost of civil legal aid, had, over a period of 10 years, had made a reduction of some 24%. So we have to disaggregate here between the civil cases and the criminal cases, and we have to concentrate on where these cuts take effect. And the cuts proposed by the government are having an effect on the most vulnerable in our society.
Thank you for the intervention, and I think that is a fair comment, and I'm certainly not going to dispute the facts of that. Now, back to Eastbourne, with the amount of money, upwards of £250,000, where the 2 charities that I've been talking about stand to lose that amount of money. This is funding that they currently use to support over 1,500 of the town's most vulnerable residents with complex problems related to death benefit and housing, a lot of which my honourable friend already alluded to. I have to say, Minister, that in my and many others' opinion, the social welfare help the government is planning to reduce is very much preventative and enabling in its nature. It is not focused on generating unnecessary litigation. It is focused on preventing crises by solving complex problems at an early stage. I will.
Would he not also accept that, of course, people face clusters of problems, and by removing some categories altogether, inevitably, even if they are still able to access some legal help, there will be areas of difficulty that mean that they can no longer get the help that they need?
I think that is a fair point, and I would look forward to hearing from the Minister exactly how he would respond to that. Now, I do recognise that these are difficult economic times and that the Ministry of Justice is faced with incredibly difficult budgetary decisions. However, I am concerned that without a clear alternative for resourcing and supporting preventative advice in particular, implementation of these proposals will not only create increased demand on the crisis-related legal advice services that remain, but increased demand on other public services. Legal aid cuts also have a particular impact on housing, I've already alluded to. Over the last few years, it has funded BHT Eastbourne Advice 800 to 900 specialist housing cases per year. This was reduced to 530 cases per year for the most recent 3-year forward contract, which commenced on the 15th of November. It is estimated that current proposals could reduce housing advice capacity by 20%. This will have a very detrimental impact on advice provision in my constituency and many other towns at a time when I expect it will be in high demand with the implementation of the reforms to housing benefit. Necessary reforms, I agree, but reforms that will have a knock-on effect. Advice is effective in preventing homelessness, especially with early help. And the proposals to limit legal aid to those in imminent threat of repossession flies in the face of all the evidence that early intervention and prevention creates long-term savings, as well as averting hardship for local constituents. I would urge the Minister to revisit it, see if there's a way of targeting the remaining funds in a different way to ensure that legal aid, particularly around civil and family law cases, is greatly protected.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Reardon, and it's a pleasure to be in this session under your chairpersonship, and I congratulate my friend, the member for North Kensington, in getting this debate today. When legal aid was first introduced in 1949, the late Arthur Skeffington said that access to law at that time was the same as access to the writs. On the basis if you could afford to pay for it, you could get there. If you couldn't, you didn't. And so legal aid was introduced, and it's something that is fundamentally very important on giving access to justice for everybody in this country. And when the Green Paper came out, according to the summary of it, the 1.2, the sentence reads, "The government strongly believes that access to justice is a hallmark of a civil society." Great, that's really good. The problem is the rest of the Green Paper. So it starts very well, and after that it's all downhill. And I think we need to examine a number of issues to do with this Green Paper. But the background to it has to be that there were already cuts being made in legal aid, which many of us in this chamber who were in the previous Parliament were very concerned about, and indeed raised those concerns consistently with ministers, because it was leaving the most marginal, most vulnerable people without any redress whatsoever through the legal system, and that is something that deeply concerns me. And this is accompanied by a series of ill-informed, unfair media attacks on the entire legal profession and the legal aid system, led by the Daily Mail, Daily Express and Evening Standard, who routinely print isolated and outrageous figures about payments to some barristers without at any time looking at the reality of the number of legal aid firms that have paid so little they've gone out of business, paid so little that they can no longer afford to represent anybody, so that in inner urban areas such as I represent, which is the 8th poorest part of the whole country, many people simply cannot get any representation whatsoever because there's no legal aid lawyer to deal with them. And so if I quote one of these letters, which I'm sure many of colleagues will have seen at various times. This came dated 1st of October 2010. Urgent information. Closure of Sheikh & Company solicitors. Non-practicing as of midnight, 30th September 2010. Saying we were unable to secure viable indemnity insurance despite our best efforts, particularly in view of uncertainty surrounding the legal aid contracts, and so it means Sheikh & Company cannot provide legal services anymore. That left thousands of people. It was a very, very busy local practice dealing with housing, immigration, family matters, education matters, a whole range of issues, left them without any representation before. Their files are then passed on through the appropriate body to another solicitor. You then find that solicitor's gone under and the files move on to somebody else, to somebody else, to somebody else, and along the way they get lost. And that means very poor, very vulnerable people are left without any representation whatsoever. And now I am very proud to represent my constituency in Parliament, and I'm very proud of Islington Law Centre. It does a great job. It does fantastic work. They pointed out to me when I went to see them a couple of weeks ago that a 10% cut across the board is being proposed in the LSC contract funding. We've been cut hard in both housing and employment, although we were ranked first in terms of our tender score, we've been given a much smaller contract from mid-November than we had previously. This will mean that 250 less employment clients per annum that we can help and 185 less housing clients. And the Director goes on to say, expecting the total cut next year to be around £130,000, which is more than 2 full-time equivalent caseworkers. This is a very, very busy law centre, doing its very best and could be replicated all over the country by very hard-working law centres. So I hope when the Minister comes to reply to this debate, he will recognise the value of law centres, the need for support and funding for them, and a recognition that without law centres, without legal aid practices in solicitors, many of our most vulnerable constituents will simply go without any access to justice whatsoever.
Order. I intend to start the wind-ups at 10:40 and have at least 6 other speakers, so if members could keep their remarks brief, then I will get all those speakers in. Robert Buckland.
Well, Mrs. Real,
actually, Madam Deputy Speaker, I was giving way to my friend. I wasn't concluding my contributions. I mean, if you want me to conclude, I suppose I must, but you just give me a little bit more.
Honourable friend, and grateful to you, Mr. Redden. I just wanted to pick up the point my honourable friend was making about advice services. I wonder whether it struck him as it struck me that in the Green Paper it suggests that we can substitute for costly legal advice with much less costly voluntary advice services. But the problem is, and the author of the Green Paper doesn't seem to realise this, most of those voluntary services are themselves funded by legal aid, and that funding will go if these proposals are implemented.
Well, absolutely. My friend makes a very, very powerful point, and it's very true, because the legal aid funding goes through law centres, it goes through the CAB, it goes through all kinds of other advice agencies. They themselves will be cut. And in any event, none of the advice services of funding is ring-fenced in local authority terms, and I've done a headcount audit of my own borough, and the level of one-to-one advice that's available is probably less than it was 25 years ago in my constituency, and I suspect colleagues could give similar stories on this. And so we do need to have access to justice, and it has to be fairly done.